It began with a smirk, thin, deliberate, and dipped in condescension, the kind of smile that doesn't invite conversation but dares you to flinch. It was early evening in Paris, 6:45 p.m., when the cameras started rolling inside Studio 5 of Leo Direct. The audience was buzzing. Anticipation hung heavy in the air. Tonight's guest had been teased for weeks. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, revolutionary leader and acting president of Burkina Faso. The man who defied colonialism's shadow and dared to speak of African dignity in global halls of silence. The man whose presence alone could command silence in the noisiest rooms. And yet, here he was, walking into the lion's den with nothing but calm eyes and a modest, unadorned suit. No flashy pins, no military medals. Just presence, quiet, composed, unshaken. The host, Marc Delarme, didn't stand to greet him. Didn't even blink. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, a rehearsed smirk forming as the red live light blinked on. A moment that should have been respectful was about to unravel into something far more revealing. "President Traoré," Marc began, his voice carrying just enough mockery to make the studio flinch. "Or should I call you Rebel Commander?" A pause. A gasp. Somewhere in the front row, a girl's eyes widened. The air tightened. But Ibrahim. He didn't move. He didn't raise his brow, didn't crack. His silence spoke volumes. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the stillness of a man who had faced far worse than televised disrespect. Marc, emboldened by his own audacity, leaned in further. "Do you really believe," he asked, "you have the experience to sit with real-world leaders?" He expected laughter. He expected applause. None came. Just the soft thrum of live silence. What Marc didn't realize, not yet, was that this night wouldn't be about questions. It would become a reckoning. And by the time it was over, it wouldn't be Ibrahim's credentials in question. It would be Marc's own relevance. This wasn't just an interview. It was something else. Something unscripted. Uncontrollable. There was a storm brewing beneath the surface, one that wouldn't come in rage or retaliation, but in truth told calmly, with piercing clarity. Ibrahim Traoré had not come to perform. He had come to stand. And when a man who stands for something enters a room full of noise, the noise learns to hush. Behind the cameras, the control room froze. No one dared speak. Even the director's hand hovered over the cut button, unsure whether to interfere or let history write itself. This wasn't going the way anyone planned, and that's precisely why the audience couldn't look away. Because somewhere between the smirk and the silence, something had shifted. Not just in the room, but in the collective pulse of everyone watching. And this was only the beginning. For a moment, the room held its breath. After the host's condescending jab, there was no sharp retort from Ibrahim, no raised voice, no flash of indignation. Instead, the revolutionary leader leaned back in his chair ever so slightly, his posture relaxed, his eyes calm. But they were searching, scanning the crowd, not for support, not for validation, but for something deeper, something truer. Then, his gaze stopped. Front row. A little black girl sat stiffly in her seat, eyes wide with hope, legs barely touching the floor. Her expression wasn't one of confusion. It was focus, unblinking, as if she was watching more than a political debate, as if she was watching for signs of courage. That's when Ibrahim finally spoke. "In my country," he began, voice low and deliberate, "we don't measure a man's worth by how many medals he wears on his chest, but by how many children sleep safely at night because of him." A hush swept across the studio. Not the kind of silence born from tension, but the kind that follows truth when it enters a room full of noise. The crowd didn't move. Even the IHE sound guy stopped adjusting the dials. And Marc? Marc shifted slightly in his seat, just enough to betray discomfort, but he wasn't done. With a practiced scoff, Mark attempted to regain the upper hand. "Well," he interjected, "you've been accused of—" Ibrahim raised one hand. Not in aggression, not even in defense. Just a gentle motion, like holding back a wave. His voice didn't change volume, but the atmosphere obeyed. "Let me finish," he said. There was no force behind the words, yet they landed with the weight of a verdict. The audience leaned forward instinctively as if pulled by gravity. Then he continued. "People like you," Ibrahim said, his tone now slower, more exacting, "think that power is wearing a tie in Paris, that it's about sitting at a desk and speaking over others." He paused. "Not for drama, for precision. But real power," he said, leaning in, "is standing in front of your people when bullets fly and refusing to run." The words hung in the air like thunder that never cracked. No shouting, no slogans, just truth, undeniable, undressed, and unafraid. And with it came the sting, not for Ibrahim, but for Mark. Gasps echoed across the studio. In the control room, a young producer whispered, "He flipped it." The director didn't blink. "No," he said. "He owned it." Back on set, Mark's lips twitched. His fingers fidgeted with the edges of his cue cards. His face was losing the smug edge it had carried just minutes earlier. He tried to push back. "That's very poetic, President," he said, forcing a chuckle. "But poetry doesn't stop terrorists." Ibrahim's jaw tightened for the briefest moment, then softened again. "You're right," he said almost tenderly. "But dignity does. Hope does. A leader without hope is more dangerous than any gunman." Then he did something no one expected. From the inside pocket of his jacket, Ibrahim pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully like it was something sacred. "This," he said, "is a letter from a 9-year-old girl in Kaya. Her village was attacked. She lost her father. And yet, she still wrote to thank me for protecting her school." His voice cracked, not out of fragility, but truth cutting through the practiced rhythms of public speaking. Then he read it, word for word. Every sentence, every childlike scrawl pierced through the audience like a silent drumbeat. When he finished, no one clapped. No one dared. Even the cameraman's hands were shaking. Mark sat frozen, his carefully outlined talking, points now worthless. This wasn't a debate anymore. It wasn't even a broadcast. It was a reckoning. Then, just as the silence started to feel unbearable, a soft voice from the crowd rose. "I know you," the woman said. Everyone turned. She stood slowly from the back row, dark-skinned, softly dressed, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "My father used to tell me about men like you," she whispered, voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "Men who fight for their people. Not for money, not for applause." Mark tried to intervene. "Ma'am, this is not—" But she raised her voice, shaking, shouting through tears. "No, you sit there mocking him, but you don't know what courage looks like. You've never had to protect a village, hold a dying child, or stand alone against the world." Her words struck the room like lightning. Ibrahim didn't move. His eyes locked with hers. "You're not just a guest," she said. "You're hope." The word echoed. First a whisper, then a ripple, then a wave. Hope. Mark looked down. He fiddled with his pen, visibly rattled. For the first time, he saw that this wasn't just politics. This wasn't optics. This was history, pain, pride. And someone had just awakened a sleeping lion. And the lion? He wasn't roaring. He was still, listening, letting others speak. Because that's what real power does. It doesn't drown out truth. It makes space for it. By dawn, that clip of the woman's tearful declaration had exploded across the internet. TikTok loops, YouTube shorts, Facebook reposts in over 100 languages. Millions watched it not with curiosity, but with reverence. You're not just a guest. You're hope. Those 6 words, paired with Ibrahim's silent, steady gaze beside her, had become the new face of leadership across the diaspora. In Ouagadougou, students marched peacefully with hand-painted signs that read, "Hope wears a uniform." In a cafe in Paris, a little boy watched the moment on a tablet and turned to his mother. "Is he a king?" he asked. She smiled. "No," she said softly. "Something better. He's a servant of his people." Meanwhile, back at the TV station, chaos brewed behind the scenes. Mark's bosses were panicking. Sponsors threatened to pull out. Comment sections were brutal. Editors clipped the viral moment, trying to spin it. But the truth was too clean to manipulate. And Ibrahim? He said nothing. No tweets, no gloating, no interviews. Because when a lion walks, he doesn't need to roar. He simply keeps moving forward. And the world follows. The days that followed were a study in contrast. On one side, the internet burned with Ibrahim Traoré's name. Millions replayed the moment again and again. The smirk, the silence, the letter, the tearful woman's voice calling him hope. It wasn't just going viral. It was going deep. Deep into living rooms in Lagos, into cafes in Paris, into classrooms in Johannesburg. Young people quoted his words. Elders nodded in quiet affirmation. Even critics, usually quick to dismiss, found themselves unsure how to spin dignity into controversy. And on the other side, Ibrahim remained silent. He didn't post, didn't gloat. No tweets, no thank yous, no reaction videos. He simply disappeared from the spotlight, but not from the story, because while the world was talking, he was walking. That same evening, while the studio scrambled to manage the fallout and sponsors demanded answers, Ibrahim Traoré took a quiet walk through the streets of Lyon. No cameras followed, no media alerts. Just his presence and his destination, a refugee shelter tucked into the city's edge. No reporters, no PR staff, just rows of cots and faces filled with fatigue. There, a little girl ran up to him and wrapped her arms around his legs. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "They said you're like magic." Ibrahim knelt, looked her in the eyes, and smiled. "No," he said softly. "I'm just a man." But magic happens when people believe in each other. Those words, though not meant for the world, somehow made it there anyway. One shelter volunteer, too moved to stay silent, posted the story anonymously. It spread like quiet wildfire. Not flashy, not viral in the traditional sense, but real, felt. Shared not out of entertainment, but out of reverence. Back at his hotel, Ibrahim's assistant handed him a crisp envelope, an official invitation from the same network, same show. A second appearance, a full hour. No interruptions. He read it carefully, then set it down and simply said, "Tell them I accept." He paused. "But this time, I won't come alone." "Who will you bring, sir?" the assistant asked, puzzled. Ibrahim smiled. The voices they never invited. And just like that, history prepared for part 2. When Ibrahim returned to the studio, it wasn't with headlines, it was with humanity. He entered silently. No entourage, no suits, no flashing badges, just a line of people behind him. A nurse from Bamako, a war orphan from Sudan, a professor from Dar es Salaam. One by one they entered, each of them walking testimonies to truths that rarely saw light. The audience was unsure what to expect. Mark, the host, looked visibly rattled. He offered a polite smile, but his eyes twitched at the corners. Something was off, and everyone felt it. Ibrahim approached the desk. This time he extended his hand first. Mark took it hesitantly. "Thank you for inviting us," Ibrahim said calmly. "We've brought some truths with us." There was no threat in his voice, no accusation, but the air shifted. The weight of what was coming was unmistakable. The cameras rolled, the lights were steady. The nurse spoke first. She held up a worn photo, what remained of a hospital reduced to ash. "This place," she said, her voice trembling, "was my workplace. It was bombed. Terrorists burned everything. But within 48 hours, President Traoré had supplies sent. Not a speech, not a promise, just action. The audience sat in stunned silence. Then the professor took the mic. My university was weeks from collapse. No funding, no government support. Ibrahim redirected his own presidential salary for a semester to keep it alive. We didn't ask. He didn't announce it. He just did it. Mark blinked rapidly, trying to regain control. His notes were useless now. This wasn't a talk show. This was a truth tribunal, but it wasn't over. Then came the youngest guest. A boy, maybe 12 years old. He looked too small for the seat, too nervous for the spotlight. But in his eyes burned something ancient, something undeniable. He stood, clutching a tiny, tattered French book. He spoke softly, stumbling over words, his accent thick. I don't have a papa. I live in a camp. One day President Traoré came. No car, no camera, just him. The room stilled. Not a cough, not a whisper. I told him I wanted to be a soldier. He said no. Be a builder. Build what they tried to destroy. He opened the book slowly. He gave me this. And he gave me dreams. A single tear rolled down the boy's cheek. That was it. Mark looked down, his jaw clenched. He had nothing left to say. Because in that moment something greater than ratings had arrived. Truth. Undeniable. Undressed. Undeniably human. He snapped. Slamming his hand on the desk, Mark barked, "Enough of this emotional circus. You're a president, not a preacher. This is politics, not a sob story session." Gasps erupted. A few people in the crowd stood up. Others shook their heads. But Ibrahim didn't flinch. He didn't respond with fury. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached calmly into a folder and pulled out a set of documents. "This," he said, "is what power looks like." The screens behind them lit up, real-time data from Burkina Faso, school programs being relaunched, farmer assistance funds activated, infrastructure rebuilding in the north, transparent reform logs from his own administration, no slogans, no applause lines, just receipts. Mark's mouth opened slightly, then closed. The room was quiet again, but not like before. This wasn't silence from shock, it was reverence. A backstage assistant holding her phone low began recording quietly. She knew something was happening, something unrepeatable. Then came the line that sealed it all. Ibrahim turned to Mark. Calm, clear, absolute. "History won't remember insults," he said, "but it will never forget impact." That moment, captured on shaky phone footage, hit social media within minutes. Within an hour, 1 million views. By nightfall, over 10 million. In Burkina Faso, boys gathered around old radios replaying his words. In Europe, influencers and politicians shared the clip without commentary, just awe. Even critics were forced to admit, this man didn't shout. He simply stood, and somehow that was louder than anything they'd ever heard, because in a world full of noise, dignity whispers, and still commands the room. By morning, the video had crossed oceans. It wasn't just a clip, it was a movement now. Shared in whispers across villages with no Wi-Fi, streamed endlessly in cafes with free internet. From the dusty hills of Kaya to polished lounges in Tiwasgar, Brussels, the message was the same. Someone had finally spoken, not at the people but for them. Across Africa, it echoed like a hymn. History won't remember insults, but it will never forget impact. In Accra, university students marched across campus with hand-painted signs. "We heard you." In Bamako, elders sat around weathered radios, nodding slowly, eyes wet with memory. In Dakar, children lined up at school, taking turns repeating, Ibrahim's words mimicking his calm, unwavering tone. He had become more than a president. He was now a voice, a mirror reflecting the dignity of people who had long been spoken over, forgotten, or doubted. Meanwhile, in a high-rise office in Paris, Marc Delarme sat alone watching the video again, and again, and again. He had mocked a man who stood for millions, and the world didn't scream at him. They didn't cancel him with noise. They ignored him with silence. His sponsors began backing away quietly. His team stopped returning emails. Even the tabloids lost interest. He wasn't trending, not for controversy, not for drama. He had simply vanished from the conversation. And that hurt more. Because Marc Delarme was never afraid of backlash. He thrived on it. But indifference? That was exile. He paced the green room one night, glass in hand, staring into the studio mirror. A reflection that now looked thinner, paler. His confidence, once crafted by performance, now cracked under truth. Not loud truth, not weaponized. Just undeniable. Then he made a rare decision. He returned to the studio. Alone. No crowd. No producers. Just a single camera, a single light, and a single chair. When the red light blinked on, Marc didn't lean forward with a smirk. He looked straight into the lens, and for the first time, he didn't perform. "I disrespected a man who represents something I didn't understand," he began. His voice was steady but small. "I was arrogant. I was wrong." The clip aired. It didn't go viral. It wasn't clipped or memed. It passed quietly like an apology left on a doorstep. But somewhere across the city, Ibrahim saw it. He didn't laugh. He didn't gloat. He simply smiled. Not because he had won, but because truth had finally been heard. Across the continent, people kept listening. In a small village outside Bobo-Dioulasso, a classroom teacher wrote a sentence on the chalkboard. "Real power is standing with your people when bullets fly." She asked her students to memorize it, not for a test but for life. In refugee camps across the Sahel, young boys repeated his phrases during play. "Hope wears a uniform. Let me finish. Build what they tried to destroy." In Ethiopia, a street artist painted a massive mural. Ibrahim, his head bowed in humility, behind him a crowd of faces, nurses, children, students, elders, all rising. It wasn't fandom, it was awakening. And in that awakening, there were stories. Letters began arriving at the presidential residence in Burkina Faso. Most were never read aloud. But one, delivered from a village far from capital lights, was opened by a staffer and passed quietly to Ibrahim. It was written in rough French. The pen had pressed so hard it tore through parts of the page. It read, "President Ibrahim, my son died last year in a terrorist attack. We buried him without a flag. There was no anthem, no cameras. Yesterday I watched you on that French program. I cried, not because I was sad, but because, for the first time, I felt seen. Thank you for making us proud to be from this land." A grieving mother. Ibrahim held the letter for a long time. He didn't speak. He didn't call a meeting. Instead, he folded the letter carefully and walked alone into the hotel courtyard. The Eiffel Tower glowed faintly in the distance. But his eyes weren't looking toward monuments of metal. They were fixed on memory. He looked to the stars, distant, silent witnesses, and whispered, "I will not stop." And in that moment it became clear. This wasn't about winning a debate. It wasn't even about a single leader or a single broadcast. It was about something the world had nearly forgotten: dignity, quiet, steady, unyielding. 6 days after the second interview, Ibrahim returned to Burkina Faso. There was no red carpet, no marching band, but tens of thousands lined the road from the airport to the city center. No chants, no cheers. They stood in silence. Men, women, children, every single one of them placing a hand over their heart as he passed. A gesture of respect, of unity, of something deeper than politics. Even the children stood still. When Ibrahim stepped off the plane, he didn't wave, he didn't speak. He looked into the crowd and simply nodded, because he had already said enough. That single gesture, one man walking back into his homeland as thousands stood in silent reverence, was captured by an old man on a cracked phone. The video became the most shared clip of the year, and for good reason. He hadn't fought with fury. He had stood with purpose. And the world, finally, listened. Not with noise, but with respect. 6 days after the world held its breath, Ibrahim Traoré came home. There were no sirens, no red carpets unfurled on the runway, no orchestras playing national hymns, no choreographed spectacle, just a quiet plane touching down on the soil that had shaped him. But the country was not quiet. From villages untouched by internet to bustling cities lit by mobile screens, they had all seen him, truly seen him. Not as a title, not as a commander, but as something far rarer. A man who didn't posture, didn't beg for praise, and yet carried the weight of millions with nothing but conviction and grace. As his motorcade began its slow journey into Ouagadougou, something extraordinary unfolded. Tens of thousands of people lined the roads, no signs, no slogans, no protests. Instead, they stood silently, shoulder to shoulder, and placed a single hand over their hearts. Old women, young boys, students, farmers, children balanced on their parents' shoulders. No one spoke. No one needed to. It was a language older than words, a gesture of silent collective reverence, not for power but for presence, not for charisma but for character. When Ibrahim stepped off the plane, he paused. He looked out over the crowd, not with triumph, but with humility. And then he gave them one small nod. Just that. But in that nod lived everything: forgiveness, gratitude, resolve, and an unspoken promise. I will not forget you. The cameras captured it, of course, but they didn't need to dramatize it. The clip spoke louder in silence than any viral rant or explosive monologue. That moment, one man returning without a word, greeted by a sea of silent hearts, became the most shared video of the year. And it wasn't because of drama. It wasn't rage, spectacle, or scandal. It was dignity. In a time when leaders shouted and people scrolled, one man simply stood, and the world stopped scrolling long enough to listen. He hadn't fought with anger. He hadn't thrown accusations. He didn't campaign for applause. He had spoken with stillness. He had answered disrespect with discipline. And the echo of that quiet courage reached further than any roar ever could. That was his legacy, not carved into monuments, but woven into people's memory. A mother remembering her son, a child reciting his words in class, a forgotten village standing a little taller, a generation finding its voice not through volume but through values. So if this story moved you, if even one line made you pause, don't scroll away. This was only chapter 1. The next chapter of Ibrahim's journey will be even more powerful. The voices he brought are just the beginning. The world is listening now. Subscribe, share, comment. Not for clicks, but for truth. Because truth isn't done speaking, it's just getting started.